There are fears that hide so deeply within us that we mistake them for the air we breathe. Fears that do not scream but whisper, quietly shaping our choices, our relationships, and even our silence. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, lived his life studying these invisible ghosts. Yet few people know that behind his sharp intellect and calm, analytical gaze, he carried fears so intimate, so painfully human, that they shadowed his every discovery. This is not the Freud of textbooks or lecture halls. This is the Freud who trembled before death, who mistrusted his own body, who feared the collapse of reason, and who sometimes could not sleep at night because he saw too much of himself in his patients. Before we enter that world, take a breath. This is not a story about theories or complex jargon. It's about what it means to be human when you strip away the illusion of control. If you've ever feared losing yourself, if you've ever been haunted by your own mind, then what Freud confessed about his greatest fears might feel eerily familiar. And if you're new here, welcome. I invite you to subscribe, not just to this channel, but to a space where the human soul is allowed to speak. Here, we don't hide from the unconscious, we listen to it. Freud's life was, in many ways, an endless confrontation with fear. From his earliest memories in Moravia to his final exile in London, fear accompanied him like a silent companion. He was a man obsessed with uncovering what others avoided. Yet, as his daughter Anna once hinted, the same analytical light he turned toward humanity also burned him from within. Beneath the philosopher, beneath the doctor, there was a frightened child, a child who learned early that the world is unpredictable, that the love of a parent can vanish, that safety is an illusion. Freud's first great fear was not death, it was loss, the loss of security, of meaning, of control. When he was a boy, his family faced poverty. His father, Jacob Freud, was gentle but weak in the young Sigmund's eyes, a man humiliated by the world's cruelty. The boy admired him, but also pitied him, sensing that love and shame can coexist. His mother, Amalia, was the opposite, passionate, sharp, emotionally volatile. Freud loved her deeply, almost possessively, and it is here in this early intensity that he later discovered the root of what he called the Oedipus complex. But behind that intellectual revelation was a wound, the fear of losing his mother's affection, the fear that love can never be secure. As he grew older, this fear of loss evolved into something more sophisticated, a fear of losing control of his mind. Freud's work demanded that he explore the boundaries of sanity. Every time he sat with a patient, listening to their dreams, their slips of the tongue, their confessions of forbidden desires, he knew he was staring into the same abyss that lived inside himself. He once wrote to his friend Wilhelm Fleiss, "I am convinced that I am on the verge of becoming neurotic." The irony was not lost on him. The man who sought to heal the human mind feared his own was unraveling. Around this time, Freud began to experience a peculiar form of anxiety that he could not fully explain. He suffered from fainting spells, heart palpitations, and periods of dread that would strike without warning. Modern psychologists might call it panic disorder, but Freud saw it as something deeper. The return of repressed emotions, the body's protest against the burden of unspoken truths. He realized that no amount of rational thought could silence what the unconscious demanded to be heard. And perhaps that was his greatest professional fear, that the mind could not be mastered, not even by its most devoted explorer. Before I go further, I'd love to know, have you ever felt that same quiet terror Freud described? That sense that your mind might be hiding something from you? That your fears are not just reactions, but messages? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes I fear my own mind. Copy and paste that if you relate, and let's see how many of us feel the same way. Because the truth is, we're all a little bit Freud when the night grows quiet. Freud's fear of death was another shadow that followed him throughout his life, but not in the usual sense. He did not simply fear the end of existence, he feared what death revealed. The limits of reason, the vanity of intellect, the collapse of the self-image he worked so hard to build. For a man who believed that every human act was driven by hidden instincts, death was the final unveiling, the moment when the ego, the proud construct of consciousness, dissolved into nothing. When he was diagnosed with cancer of the jaw in 1923, that fear became physical. The illness left him disfigured and in constant pain, forcing him to wear a prosthetic device he bitterly called the monster. Every time he tried to speak, it hurt. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw his own decay staring back. Yet even in that suffering, he tried to analyze what was happening to him. He wrote that illness stripped away the illusion of immortality, revealing how much of our daily courage depends on denial. Freud was facing not just biological death, but the psychological collapse of the self-image he had spent a lifetime constructing. And yet, he kept writing. He kept listening to patients. He kept thinking. Beneath the horror, there was still curiosity, a faint light that refused to die. That perhaps was his redemption. For Freud, understanding was not a way to escape fear, but a way to face it without turning away. He believed that when you name your fear, you rob it of its power to control you. But the truth he didn't always admit was that he was still afraid, even as he named it. There's a strange silence that fills a person's soul when the world loses its sense of meaning. For Freud, this silence was not philosophical, it was personal. Behind his books, his theories, and his relentless search for truth, there was a man terrified of discovering that life might be a stage play with no author, that the unconscious might hold no purpose other than the blind repetition of suffering. He called it the death drive, a force that pulls us not toward fulfillment, but toward our own destruction. Yet privately, he feared that this discovery was too dark, too final, too devoid of hope. Freud often said that human beings are not made for happiness, that at best we can exchange unbearable misery for ordinary unhappiness. But those who read his letters know that he didn't always believe that. In his quieter moments, especially during his long walks in Vienna, he wrote about the small joys that still reached him, the scent of a cigar, the laughter of his daughter Anna, the comfort of his dog Jofi sleeping beside him during therapy sessions. He feared that if he let go of his intellect, if he stopped questioning, these small fragments of meaning would vanish into nothing. The fear of meaninglessness haunted him most intensely during the war years. When World War I erupted, Freud was already in his 60s. The same Europe that had once celebrated reason, art, and science now tore itself apart with brutality. The rational mind he had defended all his life suddenly seemed like a fragile mask. Men were slaughtering each other in trenches, nations were collapsing, and the civilized order he believed in was burning. Freud's son, Martin, was sent to the front lines, and Freud himself watched as Vienna starved. It was then that he wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, a book that marked a turning point in his thought. He could no longer pretend that human beings sought only pleasure or happiness. There was something else, something darker and older, that compelled them toward pain and self-destruction. He called it the death instinct. But between the lines of that theory was something more personal, the reflection of his own despair. The death instinct wasn't just a discovery, it was a confession. It was Freud admitting that he saw in humanity and in himself an impulse to undo all creation, to return to nothingness. At night, he dreamt of ruins, cities collapsing, oceans swallowing the land, faces dissolving into dust. He analyzed those dreams in the morning, trying to understand what they meant. Were they premonitions, or just the mind's way of coping with chaos? In one letter, he admitted, "I cannot tell anymore whether I study dreams, or they study me." That sentence alone reveals the depth of his fear, the fear that he was not the master of his discoveries, but their victim. And yet, despite all that darkness, there was something profoundly tender in Freud's approach to fear. He didn't see fear as a defect or a weakness. He saw it as a map, a way to locate the buried truths of the soul. Every fear, he believed, hides a wish. Behind the fear of death, there is the wish for rest. Behind the fear of loss, the wish for love. Behind the fear of the unconscious, the wish to be known, fully, without masks. Perhaps that's why Freud's work endures, because no matter how much science advances, no matter how many diagnoses or pills we invent, the human heart still trembles in the dark for the same reasons he did. We fear abandonment, we fear insignificance, we fear the collapse of what we call I. And when Freud spoke of these things, he wasn't only talking about patients, he was talking about himself. There's a moment recorded by his daughter Anna that captures this vulnerability. She wrote that in his later years, when pain made it hard for him to speak, he would sometimes fall silent during dinner. She would sit beside him, waiting, and he would finally whisper, "Do you think I've done enough?" That question, simple, almost childlike, wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about legacy. It was about meaning. Beneath the surface, Freud feared that he had spent his life dissecting the soul, only to find that some wounds never heal. But maybe that was his greatest gift to humanity, showing that even the man who invented psychoanalysis could doubt his own sanity, that even the teacher of self-knowledge could fear the unknown within. He once told a friend, "Being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise." What he didn't say was how painful that exercise can be. To be honest with oneself is to face the ghosts that live under your thoughts, the unspoken griefs, the repressed desires, the silent shame. Have you ever wondered what ghosts your own mind hides? What fear keeps you awake at night, even when everything around you seems fine? Write in the comments, "I'm not afraid to know myself." Copy and paste it if you feel ready to face what your unconscious might be trying to tell you. Because sometimes the act of saying it out loud is the first step toward freedom. As Freud's health declined, his relationship with fear transformed. The man who once analyzed it from a distance now lived inside it. His cancer grew worse. The prosthesis in his mouth caused him agony. He could no longer smoke the cigars he loved. Friends who visited him wrote that he seemed both lucid and fragile, like a candle burning at both ends. Yet there was no bitterness in him. He continued to see patients until almost the very end. When the Nazis invaded Austria in 1938, Freud was forced to flee. He was 82 years old, weak, disfigured, and exhausted. His 4 sisters were left behind and later perished in concentration camps. That loss, beyond words, beyond analysis, was his final confrontation with the cruelty of the unconscious world he had tried so hard to understand. He moved to London, bringing with him only his books, his couch, and his memories. There, in a small house at 20 Maresfield Gardens, he faced his final fear, dying with dignity. In the end, Sigmund Freud's world had become small. His famous study, once filled with the voices of patients, now held mostly silence. The couch remained. The ancient figurines from his travels still lined the shelves, silent witnesses to a lifetime of searching. But the man himself was fading. Cancer had invaded his body so completely that even morphine could no longer hide the truth. He could barely eat, barely speak, and yet his mind was still awake, sharp as a scalpel cutting through the fog of pain. Those who visited him in his final weeks said there was something both terrifying and peaceful about him. His face had grown skeletal, but his eyes, those same eyes that once dissected dreams, seemed to look past the fear that once haunted him. It was as if he had finally stopped fighting it. The man who spent his life analyzing the death instinct now stood before it with a strange acceptance. Not as a scientist, not as a philosopher, but as a man stripped of all theories, left alone with the raw mystery of being alive and having to let go. Freud had always insisted that the goal of psychoanalysis was not happiness, but freedom. Freedom from the compulsions of the past, from the invisible forces that rule our lives without our consent. And now, in the quiet of his final days, he seemed to test his own idea. Could he even now be free from fear? Could he face death without illusion, without denial? He did not pray. He did not ask for redemption. He simply asked for relief. One September night in 1939, he called his physician and friend, Max Schur, to his bedside. Schur had promised Freud long ago that when the suffering became unbearable, he would not prolong it. Freud looked at him calmly and said, "Now it is nothing but torture and makes no sense." Schur hesitated, but Freud repeated, "Do not fail to keep your promise." It was not a plea. It was an affirmation, the last act of control in a life obsessed with understanding control. That night, and again the next morning, Schur administered the doses of morphine that allowed Freud to drift into unconsciousness. He did not wake again. It is said that his final expression was one of serenity. Perhaps because for the first time, he had entered what he had always studied, the great unknown of the unconscious, but without the need to interpret it. In those final hours, all his theories, repression, dreams, death drive, Oedipus complex, dissolved into the one truth that no mind can escape, that fear ends where surrender begins. And maybe that is the deepest lesson Freud left us, the one hidden beneath the heavy language of his books. We spend our lives running from fear, building theories, distractions, and illusions to protect us from the unbearable simplicity of our condition. But the moment we stop running, the moment we look directly at what terrifies us, our mortality, our loneliness, our own mind, something shifts. The fear does not vanish, but it softens. It becomes human. It becomes ours. For Freud, fear was not an enemy, but a guide. It pointed toward the places where truth was buried. Every neurosis, every symptom, every dream was in his view, a map to something that needed to be faced, not erased. And in the end, by facing his own death with the same honesty he demanded from his patients, he lived his philosophy to its final consequence. Imagine him there, surrounded by the things he loved. The small statues of gods and goddesses from forgotten civilizations, the smell of old books, the faint echo of Vienna in his mind. The city he left behind, the family he lost, the students who carried his name into the future. He knew that after he was gone, others would distort, criticize, idolize, and misunderstand him. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that he had dared to look inside, dared to name what others denied, dared to say that the human soul is not rational, not clean, not perfect, but that it is real. And in that truth, he found a strange kind of peace. A peace that did not come from certainty, but from surrender. He once wrote, "In the end, we must begin to love in order not to fall ill, and we must fall ill in order to love." Perhaps he finally understood what he meant by that love and fear are not opposites, but companions, that to live fully one must be willing to feel both. For us, reading or hearing this now, Freud's fears are not just history, they are mirrors. The fear of losing control, the fear of losing love, the fear of death, the fear of discovering that our mind is not entirely our own. These are not Freud's alone, they are ours. And maybe the courage to face them begins not with therapy or theory, but with honesty, with saying, "Yes, I am afraid, and still I will look." So tonight, if you find yourself lying awake, thoughts spinning, heart heavy, remember this. Even the greatest mind of the 20th century wrestled with the same darkness. He too doubted. He too feared. And yet he kept listening, not to the noise of the world, but to the quiet voice beneath it, the one that speaks only when everything else falls silent. That is where the unconscious begins, and maybe where peace begins too. If this story touched you, take a moment to subscribe, Not for algorithms, not for numbers, but because this space is for you, for those who dare to think, to feel, to question what lies beneath the surface. Here we explore the soul, not to fix it, but to understand it. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what do you fear losing the most? Control, love, or meaning? Write it down, not as an answer, but as a confession. Because when we name our fears, as Freud taught us, we begin to reclaim our power from them. Freud's life began with fear, but it ended with acceptance. And in that journey, from trembling child to dying sage, he left us the greatest map of all, not to avoid fear, but to walk through it until we find ourselves again.